Hello friends, welcome back to Aunt Debbie's Boutique. I am so sorry that it has been a total week since I posted a video on this, but the embellishment and even making the blocks just took longer than I had allotted time for. So I'm running a little bit behind, but I think it's going to be worth it in the end. Today we're going to construct our jacket using the fabric we made from our crazy quilt. The pattern I'm using is by Kate Sew. It is, what is it called? I've got the pictures out of order here. It's a kid's quilt coat pattern. Exactly what we needed, and it was exactly what I was looking for. I have not made a pattern of hers before, but reading through the instructions, it's very, very easy to follow, and like I said, it's exactly what I was looking for. So providing it fits well, I think I would highly recommend it. Now, I respect all the time and effort that a pattern designer puts into her patterns, and therefore I'm not going to be showing the actual pattern pieces. I'll show the cutout pieces, but I don't want to compromise the integrity of her work. These pictures are not real good because my printer is low on some colors of ink and I just keep forgetting to get more. So the pictures are really much more vivid and prettier online than the way I printed them. Now, the view we're making today is this one that has the little Peter Pan collar on it. And the only thing I have changed about the pattern is, you can probably see it better here, the pockets she has are on the outside. And I prefer side inset pockets, and so I just self-drafted a pocket for that, and I'm going to insert it in the sides. So that's the only change that I'm making. You can see that there's a border, a bias tape border around all of this, and I made my own bias tape. This is all cut on the bias. I've got 10 times more than I need, but I have a video I'll link below on the different methods to cut your own bias tape and sew it together, and I used the method where you start with a rectangle and cut a diagonal around it, through it, and then sew 2 seams, and it's ready to cut, so you don't have to sew a whole bunch of pieces together. But the problem with that is I never know how big of a piece of fabric to start with, so I have a whole lot of extra, but that's okay. I'll use it. Now, before we start on the pattern, I want to show you what I had left. I had pieces of the fat quarters left, most of them. Some of them I used them all. I think that's still, yeah, these are still fat quarter. And I had a handful of little strips and a big wad of crumbs. Now I'm going to save all of this because I also have some yardage that I ordered of some of the prints, 4 different prints. I've used most of this one, but I have in my head a picture of a denim crumb purse where you sew lots of crumbs onto it. And if I get around to designing a good pattern for it, we'll do a video on that someday too. But I love crumbs too. If I don't use them in a project, I throw them in a pillowcase that I have below my table here. And when it gets about 3/4 full, I sew it up and donate it to an animal shelter. It makes a great dog bed. So I had all that left from, I think there was probably a dozen fat quarters. I'd have to look back and see. The fabric line is called Hydrangea Mist. Okay, let's get started with what we have to do today, what all we need. I have cut out all my pieces. And I guess, let me just lay all this aside and show you. They just turned out beautiful. Okay, this is our back. There's threads everywhere. I'm so glad you can't see the floor in my sewing area here. It's full of crumbs and threads. Okay, this is the back piece. These, let's see, there we go, are the two front pieces. And these are the two sleeves. And there is about 10 embellishments on every square. Now, there's a few small ones I didn't do. You don't have to do every square. But with 40 squares, that's 400 strips of fancy stitching, and that just took a long time. Okay. So we need our basic pattern pieces. We're also going to need, what happened to my other pieces? Okay, I must have grabbed them up when I grabbed all the scraps. Yes. These are the pockets that I self-drafted. They're not real big, but she's not a very big girl. And we need a collar. There's so much fabric in this, so many pieces, and it's so busy. I wanted to try to keep it simple. The lining fabric that I used, and I should have shown you some of the back sides of these, I am using it for the binding and for the collar. So we don't have so many different fabrics everywhere. I just thought it'd be too busy. The one thing I am doing different is the underside of the collar I'm making in this blue. So we need 2 of these long facings, one that was cut on fold of the back facing. We need a top collar, a bottom collar, our pockets, and interfacing for all the facings. Then we're going to need buttons, and I found these on Etsy, and I thought, I mean, they're kind of gaudy, but for a little girl, they like that kind of stuff, or at least I hope they do. They're just full of rhinestones and pretty pinks, and I think they'll really embellish this well. I got this from Sassy Passy Boutique, and it is Nicole Rector is the owner. I found her on Etsy. She had lots of cute buttons, but this was just, I wanted something pretty that would stick out and be pretty special. So there's our buttons. Okay, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is take our 2 collar pieces and our collar interfacing. Now, I haven't ironed all these real good. If I can't get the creases out, I'll put a little best press on them. And we're going to I'm using iron-on interfacing. She suggests sew-in interfacing, but this is what I had. This is SF101 by Pellon. And we're just going to iron it on the top collar. Okay, once that's done, we're going to put right sides together, and I'm going to take it over the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew all the way around these three sides, leaving this side open. So meet me at the sewing machine. Now that we've got that sewn, you can either clip your corners or do what I do. I'm just going to trim this whole thing with my pinking shears. And if you can see about how close I get to it, this just cuts notches out for you. And you don't have to do all that clipping. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. And give it a good iron. I want to make sure I've got my corners all pulled out. And these are nice rounded corners, so they're not as hard to pull out. And here's our collar. That's the top side, that's the underneath side. Now ordinarily I would top stitch it at this point, but we're going to top stitch it later once the facings and everything are on. So let's lay this aside. The next thing I want to do is take my two sleeve pieces and my binding, and I'm going to go on the wrong side. See, this is what the wrong side looks like. It's still very pretty, but it'll be on the inside of the jacket. And with right sides together, I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam. Now all these seams are 3/8 inch on this pattern, but for the purpose of the binding, I'm just going to do 1/4 inch. I cut my binding 1 1/4 inches. I don't even know if it said how wide to do it, but I just wanted about 1/4 inch of it to show, and so I gave a little bit of extra. If I just wanted to do 1/4 inch, an inch would have been wide enough, but I put a little bit extra to account for the thickness of this fabric. So we will sew this binding piece on here, then we'll bring it back over here, turn it over, and iron it to the front, and then we'll top stitch on the front. So let me take a couple of binding pieces here, about the same size. and more threads. Let's go back over to the sewing machine and put the binding at the bottom of these sleeves. Okay, now that these are sewn onto the back, I'm going to press them around to the front and then press this over halfway till it meets the edge of the fabric. And then I'm going to pin it to the front and top stitch it. Now I just put a few pins to kind of hold it. When I get it over to the machine, I'll take those pins out as I go and I'll kind of stretch it so it lays nice and smooth on there. Now this binding that I put on here, it was cut on the bias, which is a 45-degree angle. And the reason for that is so it can stretch around curves. And if you were just putting the binding on the sleeves and around the bottom, like it appears in the pattern, you could cut it on the straight grain. But we're also going to be putting it around the armhole to cover that seam, and it needs to bend with the curve, and so that's why it's cut on the bias. And when you're sewing it down, you have to be careful not to stretch it too much because it is on the bias and the bias will stretch. Now I'm going to go over to the machine and top stitch this down. Now, just give it a nice steam press here. And that's the band of our sleeve. That's all that's going to be showing. Now we can lay our pockets aside. The next thing I want to do, I said our pockets, our sleeves aside. I had pockets on the brain. The next thing I want to do is put our pockets, attach them, they are, to the front and back. Now, this is where I'm deviating from the pattern just slightly. If you're following the pattern, you would at this point put your pocket and sew it on top of the front. Just this was so busy already, I didn't want to add a busy pocket too. So, but I did want a pocket. All little girls want pockets. Now let's see. I'm going to get confused here. Right sides together. This is what I want. I am going to position this with right side together, and I want it to stop a little bit before my hem. And I want to make sure, well, that's not going to work. That's on the inside. Okay, this is in the side seam on the outside edge of our pocket. Now I'm going to turn this one this way so I can get it at the exact same place. I could have just measured. That would have probably been more scientific. Okay, and then I want to put it on the back also. And you can see this is where my seam is going to be, so it's cut in just a little bit there. I'm just going to put a pin right here where it cuts in. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now I'm going to take this over the machine and I'm going to just stitch just this piece that's going to be in the side seam on all 4 of these. Okay, our pockets are ready to be sewn, but we're not going to do that just yet. We'll sew them when we sew our side seams together, and then they'll be on the inside. So we're going to lay this aside for now. We're just doing all our prep work. Okay, our next step is we're going to be setting our sleeves in here in just a little bit. Well, I tell you what, before we do that, let's go ahead and sew our shoulder seams. So with right sides together, I've pinned them, and now I'm going to take them over to the machine and just sew a 3/8" seam across the top. Okay, I've sewn the shoulder seams, and I could just press them open at this point and leave them. But I want finished seams on the inside. So what I'm doing is, well, I should have pressed them to the same side, shouldn't I? I'm going to use a little more of our bias tape. And I'm going to come back on here and sew it. I could have sewed it at the same time. and then I'll fold it over, and I'm going to stitch it down towards the back. We'll just have a little top stitching there at the back, but that'll make it lay nice and flat, and it won't bother the child. Now, we could just fold it over so that that piece is sticking up, but I want it to lay nice and flat, so we'll do that. So I am going to sew from the front side with right sides together, and then I'll show you how I fold it over. Okay, before I fold it over, I want to trim my seam just a little bit so that it lays nice and smooth, because this is not a very wide bias. Then I'm going to fold it over like this, fold it under a little bit. And let's go ahead and iron it so maybe it'll lay down a little better. Laying it down nice and smooth. Ouch. Don't stick yourself. Don't want blood on my jacket. Doesn't look like it's bleeding. And when I'm done, I'll trim off that excess. Okay, now I'm just going to top stitch it a little bit, and then our seam won't show, and it'll be laying nice and smooth too. Okay, they're stitched down, and you can hardly see it on the outside. It's that white seam right there, and it's on the back. And this way we have a nice enclosed seam that will be comfortable for the little girl. Now, I need to interject here that that's optional. You do not have to do that. That's just something that I wanted to do. Okay, now we'll lay it aside and work on our sleeves. And the instruction says to put a stitch around here, just a regular stitch, not a gathering stitch, which kind of surprised me. So I guess it is just to help it draw it in ever so slightly. So we're going to go over to the machine and do that just to help us ease the sleeve into the sleeve pocket. Okay, I've put my seam right there, and this should be the center. So with right sides together, I'm going to first pin the center. Now, the pattern says you're going to have to tug and pin, put a lot of pins, and that is usually the case in setting in sleeves with fabric that's this stiff. So that's what we're going to do. It can be done. It just takes a little more patience. Uh-oh, here's another string. I'll go down here and pin my end. And then make everything fit in between. Okay, that went in just fine. So let me finish pinning the rest of it. Okay, I have both sleeves pinned in. I'm going to take it over to the machine. And I think I will sew from this side, the body side, not the sleeve side, because that's the side that's going to have a tendency to kind of gather up so I can keep it nice and smooth. So let's go over to the machine and do this. We're going to have to go slow and steady, especially when we get here to where our where we put the facing over or the bias over our seam. There's a lot of seams right there. So we're going to want to go really slow through that part. Okay, we've got both of our sleeve seams sewn in. Let's see how we did on the other side. It looks pretty good. No gathering. Another string. Okay, let's look at this one. Yep, that lays nice and smooth. So it fits real good, and the pattern instructions were good on that part. Okay, I also want to enclose these seams. So I am going to sew this with the right side down to the sleeve portion, and I'll probably sew it just inside of our seam, and then we'll lap it over onto the shoulder part and top stitch it down. Okay, now I'm going to fold this, and as you see, this stretches. This is why we need the bias. and it will go around the curves real nicely. I don't think I'll iron that. Well, yes I will, because I want to iron that seam down so everything is nice and smooth. Well, maybe I won't. My iron is shut off. Okay, then I won't iron it before. Okay, I've had a slight change of plans here. I am going to hand whip this down, and the reason for that is the amount of bulk. I'm afraid my seam on this side would get kind of wonky looking. So let's take a break and I'll go hand whip this down, and then we'll come back and finish our jacket. Okay, now look at how nice our sleeves look on the outside. And on the inside too. There is no rough seam to bother the child, and it's nice and enclosed so there won't be any raveling or falling apart. I just used a blind stitch to hand stitch that down, and I think that it was the right decision. With all the curves and the thickness, I wouldn't have had a nice clean seam back here like I did at the shoulder seam. So I'm glad I did it that way. Okay, now it's time to sew up our side seams. Okay, and before I do that, I'm going to go over there and top stitch these pockets, but I'll do that off camera. I should have done that when I put them on. I just didn't think about it. Now what we'll do is line up all of our seams, and we're going to have a really bulky seam right there, so you're going to have to go slow. And we want to make sure that we line them up perfectly at the bottom of the sleeve and at the bottom of the jacket. And then we'll just force them by just tugging a little bit, and it all, if it was cut out properly, it should all go together just right. Now, when I get to this part, when I get here a 1/4 of an inch in, or 3/8 of an inch, I'm going to sew around this, back up the side there until it's a 1/4 inch in, then over here and finish my seam. So I won't be sewing this part here because we don't want to sew our pocket closed. I'm not going to pin this just yet because I want to go over and top stitch my pocket seams, and then I will stitch it all on the machine and you can watch me do that. Okay, I've decided I'm going to also stitch in my bias tape here while I'm doing it, so I won't have to do a separate seam. I want to fold just a little bit over here at the top because we're at the edge of the sleeve, and I don't want a raw edge there. Okay, I'm stopping this at the pocket, and I'm going to fold it over a little bit there too. Then I'm going to start it up again just for the last little piece. All right, I've sewed my side seams. I didn't have too much trouble. It was a little bulky right here, but I went back and forth, backstitched a little to make sure that I got it good and that it didn't come undone. And now I'm going to iron this. And then turn it over like we've been doing, and I'm going to hand whip it down all the way around. And because there's no way you could sew this on the sewing machine anyway. I hadn't thought that far ahead, but that doesn't take very long, so I'm going to take care of that and then I'll get back with you. Okay, here's our jacket sewn together. I covered those seams too. The pockets don't look real pretty in there, but at least the seams are all covered. Now we just have to do the collar and facings, the buttons and buttonhole, and the binding around the edge. So we're almost done. Okay, I went ahead and ironed on the inner facing to all of the pieces. And this is how it's going to fit on our jacket. So we want to sew these two shoulder seams that attaches the back facing to the front facing. And then while I'm over at the machine, I am going to fold under about 1/4 inch and stitch it down all the way on the outside just to finish that outside edge. Now if you have a serger, that's perfectly fine. You just don't want it raveling. You could serge around it, you could zigzag around it, but I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch down. So let me go do that. Okay, I forgot to turn the camera on when I sewed that, but you can see I sewed these two seams and I want to iron them open. If we hadn't covered our seams, we would have ironed open all of our seams. They would have been pretty bulky to iron open, but that takes some of the bulk out. Now I'm going to iron this little 1/4 inch hem I put around the edge. Okay, let's put our collar on now. Wait, there is one more thing we need to do. We need to take a 4-inch, I thought this was kind of a cool feature. We're going to take a 4-inch piece of our binding, bias tape, whatever. We'll fold it in half. That's hot. Then fold both sides into the center. And I'm gonna real quickly go stitch this down, and we're gonna have a loop to put on the back of our coat so it can be hung up. Okay, here's our loop. We need to find the center. Let me just do this because I'm going to need the center again here in a minute. I'm just going to put a little tiny little V right there. Okay, I was confused for a minute, but I got it straightened out. It goes on the back of the facing, not on the collar. So I just stitched that down. Now we're going to take our collar, I want to make sure I've got the center back, and again just a tiny little notch. And I'm going to line up my notches here. And I'm going to pin this all the way around. And I believe there is a mark on the pattern piece that shows where it should end up. And I'm just going to make sure it ends up in the same place on both sides. If it doesn't, I need to readjust. Okay, let me see. That is about 4 inches. That is almost, a little bit over 4 there. Now I'll measure this to make sure. Okay. Now I'm just going to go over and base this on for right now. Okay. Now we're going to pin this right sides together. All the way around. Take it over to the machine and stitch it with a 3/8 inch seam. We want to match up our shoulder seams, our center back, and just make the rest of it fit. Okay, let's go sew it in place. Okay, this has been sewn all the way around. I'm going to clip these two corners up here. We don't want to cut through our threads, but we want to eliminate as much of the bulk as possible. So when we turn it right side out, it will at least resemble a square corner. And then I'm also going to trim the curve with my pinking shears. I better do it from this way. Boy, these are dull. They're, I think, too dull to cut through all that. So I will do it the old-fashioned way. See if my other scissors are better. And clip. Yeah. Now, let's turn it right side out. Okay, now I'm going to, let me turn it so you can see it a little better. I'm going to take it over to the machine and I'm going to top stitch all the way around. I'm going to go under the collar and I'm going to catch this going down all the way around. We're almost there. Okay, I will probably go in and hand tack the interfacing down, but I may not. It looks like it'd stay just fine. Now then, we need to do our buttons and buttonholes. Okay, I just had to go check something. The collar on the picture comes much further in. And I went and checked, and I've cut the right size of everything, so I'm not sure why my collar doesn't come all the way around. I will look at it some more after the video is over. I mean, everything fit and sewed together just perfectly. So maybe I was supposed to stretch the collar a little more. I don't think so, but I will see if I can figure that part out, and either I may have to take it out. We'll just see. Okay, I'm going to overlap this about 1.5 inches. We're going to put one buttonhole about 3/4 of an inch down. So I'll start my first buttonhole there. I have 5 buttons, so I'm going to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to space them out 1, 2, 3, 4. about like that. Okay, I've marked all my buttonholes, and this is a real handy little device. I'll see if I can find one and link it in the comments. And every machine is different on how you do buttonholes, so I'm not going to bother to show you how to do a buttonhole because your machine would be different anyway. I'm just going to go put the buttons and buttonholes on, and I'll meet you back here. Okay, we're done with our jacket. I put all the buttons and buttonholes on, and I went ahead off camera and put the binding around the bottom just like we did on the sleeve. I didn't think you needed to watch that again, and this is going to be long enough video as it is. We have our pockets here on the side, and the only problem I had was this collar. It really should have come in probably another 1.5 inches on each side. And I went back and checked the pattern pieces, and the pattern pieces are correct, and I cut it out according to the pattern pieces. So the only thing I can ascertain is all this bulk made it not want to stretch as much. I thought about taking it off and putting it back on and stretch it, but I don't think there's any way I could stretch it that much. I just think it's because of the bulk of the fabric that I used here. If you think about it, we have all these seams. These crazy blocks have lots of little pieces in it, and they're sewed onto a foundation piece, so that's another layer. Then we put on the stitching, and that adds another layer, and we've got the lining. This is a nice heavy coat. I think I'm just going to leave it like it is. It looks fine in my opinion. It would have probably been better if the collar had come all the way around, or maybe I should have done the hood option, but I might have had the same problem with that. So it's not the pattern designer's fault. I want to make that perfectly clear. Her pattern pieces line up. It is, the fault lies with me, and I will not be satisfied till I research it even more and see where exactly I got off, but it looks like I should have tried to stretch that collar just a little bit more around there. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm sorry it was so drawn out, but this has been in my head for a long time, and I thought since it was a crazy quilt that you might enjoy it, and so that's why I brought you along. I think my little redheaded girl is going to love all this pink. That's her favorite color, and I just hope it fits and lasts her for another season. If you'll join us again next time, we're going to start on the 3 quilts that each take a yard of fabric each. So if you want to sew along with me, you need 3 1-yard pieces that coordinate, because we're going to be mixing and matching the fabrics together, so you want them to go together. If you want the backing to match the front, you'll need another 1.5 yards for each quilt. We're going to make a quilt in the next, it's a very simple quilt, so you'll enjoy it. We're going to make the quilt in the next video, and then we'll, for the 3 following videos, we will quilt each one a different way, so I can demonstrate some ways to do your own quilting. And just a announcement about the sample quilt and where it stands. I did send it to the long arm quilter to be quilted. Her whole family had the flu, and then she had to have some surgery, so it's probably going to be March before I get it back. But when I do, we'll do the binding together and show you the final product. Okay, thank you for joining me today. If you would, please like and subscribe, comment, share, whatever. I appreciate each and every one of you. And remember, whatever you do, do it to the glory of the Lord.